Hello and welcome to another episode of the HaskinCast Podcast. I am your host, Scott Haskin, and I'm here with another special guest, my buddy, film composer Bruce Bray, who is based out of Phoenix, Arizona. And you know, the funny thing is, well, not funny, but interesting, I guess, is that film composition is one of those things that you really can do from anywhere now. Depending on the director and what they're willing to do, as far as some of them really kind of want you to be in the room and do a spotting session in person. But I've done some over the net. Some you can do over Skype. You can do through Google Hangouts, where you can actually bring the movie online. You can talk. One person controls the movie so they can pause it, go back, whatever. And you can do a spotting session that way now, whereas you didn't used to be able to do that. You used to have to be there and watch the copy of the movie together. So another way to do it is to each have a copy of the movie and just kind of watch it in sync with each other. But that becomes challenging because each person's going to stop at a different spot, roll it back to a different spot. So not the most ideal, but it can be done that way. You can do it over the phone, over audio, and just use that following the movie. But really, having the visual and the person is really the way to do it. So we're hot on the heels of my last episode where I talked about my book, Becoming an Indie Film Composer. I could not believe I had not done a podcast on that already. Shame. But now it's done, huh? And some of the things that I talked about in the book, especially with regards to the 48-hour film challenge, we talk about a little bit in this podcast, get Bruce's opinion on some of that stuff. I had already interviewed him when it dawned on me that I hadn't recorded the book podcast yet. So this is kind of a little bit backwards from my world. I talked to Bruce, then I did the podcast on the book. Now you're hearing Bruce's podcast. So, but lots of great stuff, lots of great information. Bruce is such a talented guy. I really like his approach. I really like the way that he looks at music and strives to do more to really bring the listener, or, you know, in the case of a film composer, I guess it would be viewer would be the proper term, but the way that he brings the viewer in to really experience the score along with the film. And we talk about some strategies for that. We also talk about how to get started, how to network, that sort of thing. And it was a great conversation. This is the first time that Bruce and I have ever actually spoken, which happens to be with some of my guests. Like some of them I've met in person, which is great. Some of them I've known for years. Some of them I've worked on projects with, and others I've talked to over the internet for years, but we've never actually had a direct conversation on the phone or in person. And Bruce is one of those people. You know, we chat up every once in a while because we're both up late working. And sometimes, you know, you got to render a file, or you're just like, you know what, I need to get away from this for a minute. And one of us will reach out to the other one because we're probably up and working on projects. So it works out well. But Bruce is a great guy. I was grateful to get some time with him and be able to speak to him and to be able to bring that interview to you guys. So a couple house cleaning things. I don't know why they call it house cleaning, but that is the term. Thank you guys all for those of you who have left reviews, who have written to me with questions and guest suggestions and all that sort of thing. Very, very much appreciated. Thank you to Audionamics for supplying the Instant Dialogue Cleaner, IDC, that helps me keep the audio of this podcast pristine. I have just recorded, I'm going to do a series of videos on how I create and complete the podcast. And they're going to be fairly short. I'm going to keep them as much as I can to the point of the software and the processes. Because, you know, you guys all know me. I tend to get a little wordy when I'm left without supervision. So, but for these, I really want to highlight the process and the products. These are just the ways that I found to do things. I'm changing the process here and there. I've already redone my 2020 template like 3 times, but every time it gets better, and I'm trying different things and it looks like they're going to work. And then I find a better way to do it. So I have to modify the template. But I'm bringing you those. The first one I've done is I've done one on Audionamics IDC, the Instant Dialogue Cleaner, which is the biggest staple of what I use besides Cakewalk, which is the program I use to record it. And so that video, if it's not out already, will be coming out very shortly to my YouTube channel. So the link to the YouTube channel is in the show notes. Please look there, and I will have a like a playlist of podcast I guess podcast training videos or something. I'll figure out something nice to call it. So that'll be there. and that'll be nice. And for you guys that are curious about how I do the podcast, that'll be there. And I'll be bringing on some other videos as I have time. I'm also doing some walkthrough videos of some software. I haven't started on those yet, but that's next. I'm starting with the new Nada library from Eduardo Terralante over at Best Service. I love this library. I was fortunate enough to be a beta tester on it, and I've been working with it for a couple of months now, and it's absolutely fantastic, especially for those of us who write a lot of new age or meditation music. And while it's geared to that, it can be used for anything, for film score, for documentaries, all kinds of stuff. You can head over to bestservice.com. I think it's bestservice.com, and check that out. Or you can just Google search Nada and Best Service, and you'll find it. Absolutely great little program. I know that Dirk has done a walkthrough of it, and I'll be doing one very shortly. Again, if it's not already up on the YouTube page by the time that this airs. So that's it. Thank you guys, all of you who have shared the podcast. Please remember to leave a rating on Apple Podcasts, 1 star, 5 stars, whatever you feel is appropriate. I'd rather have you be honest than just try and pump me up, even though it's always exciting to see a five-star review. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please feel free to share it with those who you think might get a little something out of it. It's tough because I have such a wide variety of guests to say, I should share this with my musician friends or my actor friends or my director friends, because you never know who I'm going to get on the show. But that's probably, to me at least, part of what's cool about it is it's a different conversation every week. And I have different people, different angles, different subjects. And but it all relates to learning about the business and learning about different facets of entertainment and all the things that go into a production, so that you can really appreciate everything that you see, and not just the show, the film, the performance, whatever it is. And it really is amazing what it takes to make any project happen, whether it's a short film, whether it's one of these Cirque du Soleil shows, whether it's a feature-length film, any of these things. It's an incredible amount of work that goes into all of them. Most of that stuff the people that are outside of the business don't get to see. So it's good to get some insight on that and really learn to appreciate what it takes to have art become a real thing and be deliverable to you or shown in a place where you can go check it out. And one of those people is Bruce Bray. Let's talk to Bruce. All right, ladies and gentlemen, as I say every week, I am very excited to bring on this week's guest, or one of this week's guests, depending on how the release schedule goes. I haven't figured that out yet, but a friend of mine who also has been working in Phoenix as a film composer for a god-awful long time, and he is very, very high in demand, so I was happy to steal some time with him. My buddy, Bruce Bray. Bruce, how are you?
I'm doing great, man. It's nice to be here tonight.
Well, thanks a lot for spending some time with me. I know that you've just been working on project after project.
I have. I kind of, as a matter of fact, I usually, before I even finish one, I'm kind of already starting another one and getting that one going. So I'm usually working on multiple projects at once.
Yeah. And I love that. I mean, obviously you're very good at what you do. Otherwise you wouldn't be in such demand. I mean, they're not stuck to Phoenix like they would be for an actor or a director, but you get like a good majority of the work down there in the indie world.
I do get quite a bit of work. I mean, I think for a while I was trying to, kind of seek out the work. And then once I work with a director, it seems like, you create that language that you have between each other, because that takes a little bit of time. And once you establish that, then once that director is ready to make another film, I mean, most of the time I wind up doing the next film with them as well.
Well, that's part of it. I mean, building a good team of people that not only are competent enough to do the work, but people that you enjoy working with. You've built a good relationship. You know how to communicate with each other. Why would you go anywhere else once you've established that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I think it's unique, as once when you work with a director, I mean, I think as a composer, we're one of those post people that you wind up working one-on-one, and it's a little different. When they're making a film, you have a whole crew of people, and you have 30 or 50 or 100 people, whatever the case may be, all on set doing things. And then the director is, working with all of those people. And it's more of I guess, a public kind of setting. But when you work with a director on a film, you have a much more of an intimate relationship with that individual, because I mean, music is such a large part of film, and, there's so many different ways that you can go with music. And so it's important that you establish that intimate friendship or relationship that you have with that filmmaker so that you can help them to kind of, explain their vision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's such an important conversation because a lot of times the directors won't know how to speak to a composer musically, and a musician won't know how to speak to a director in a film sense. So it's really, for me, I stopped talking about instrumentation and themes, and I just started talking about emotions with the director. What do you want the audience to feel when they see this scene, more so than, do you want a trumpet here? Are you looking for something that strings? How do you approach the first film that you do with a director?
I would say what you just said is pretty much how that works. If I can, I like to really spot the film with a director, where you sit down and take the time to, make notes and, there's so many different things to talk about. And that is where we can put music, where maybe we shouldn't have music. What you're trying to accomplish with each scene, whose point of view, which character, a character's point of view, because that obviously tells you a lot, because, you're trying to think of which character in that particular scene that you're trying to express their point of view. A tempo, what kind of tempo tempo is big, even though I agree with you. I don't talk about instrumentation much. I do like to talk about tempo because every scene has tempo, and maybe the tempo that I'm thinking of might be different than what they're thinking of. And so, all of a sudden we get into those discussions, and that makes a big difference. But at the end of the scene, it's still, what kind of emotional landscape it is that the director is looking for in that particular scene.
Well, and that's a great point that you bring up about the tempo, because every scene, you're right, it does have a pulse. It has a heartbeat to it, but maybe the heartbeat that you're seeing the film on, because maybe you're seeing like a slow anticipation build. And in the director's mind, they're already 3 steps into that anticipation. So they're feeling it in a completely different rate. That is very important to keep that conversation going.
It is. And also, and once you establish, the other thing too is that, also the styles that they have. There's I don't know if you've run into this, but one of the things I've run into with directors is sometimes directors, they became directors because of those wonderful movies that they saw when they were younger. Mm-hmm. And they get attached to the idea of what those movies meant to them. And then the music that they heard then kind of becomes prevalent in their mind. And so you almost have this moment where you kind of have to talk to the director, and sometimes you have to remind them that, you want to do modern music. You don't want to make music that sounds like it's, 30 or 40 years old or something. And so then you kind of also have so sometimes, you have to kind of convince directors to do things, and then sometimes they have to convince you to do things. It's just kind of the way that goes.
Well, and there is certainly a certain element of compromise and knowing when to pick your battles. If you have something you feel very strongly about, you have to decide whether it's important enough to the film to potentially ruin that relationship, or if it's not, and it's better to save the relationship and just give in to what the director wants. It's a pretty interesting art, that negotiation in and of itself.
It is. And then sometimes, you'll have like a thing happen that's almost automatic, and you don't realize that makes it easy. Like, for example, I was working on this film called Planet George, which was a feature-length comedy, and the director, Carrie Frederick, she's a lot younger than I am. And when I went to spot the film with her, I noticed when I walked in, she had this poster of the Ramones on the wall. And I said, "Oh, you know who the Ramones is?" She goes, "Yeah, my mom and I, and we love punk rock." And I'd had this idea when I saw the film before that maybe it could be, because I don't get to do many guitar-oriented tracks, film. And I said, I think that perhaps, a good way to go on this would maybe be to bring some energy of some guitar-oriented music. And she goes, I agree, and I was thinking the same thing. And so then it kind of made that job a little bit easier because we were already thinking on the same wavelength,
Right. Yeah, that really does help. And it's good that you feel with the relationship that you have the ability to make those kind of suggestions on the fly and say, what if we took this approach? Because sometimes, yes, the director may have something in mind, but that doesn't mean that they aren't open to hearing something else.
And you know what? And that's true. I actually find that most directors are very open. I think that the thing that's kind of hard in the beginning, I think, is kind of nailing the feel, the feel that they want. That's really the hardest part. And then once you get that feel, because that's what I try to develop something that's tonal, something that expresses the tone and the tone that they're looking for. And I before I even want to compose a bunch of pieces, I try to just focus on maybe an idea or one scene or something that can express, a lot of the instrumentation that I'm kind of feeling after talking to them. So I'll try to create something that's just that one. I don't go in and try to attack the whole film.
Right.
I want to establish the tone that the director's looking for. And then once I can get that established with them, then I feel a lot more comfortable about moving ahead, and, starting to get the ideas for some of those other scenes down.
Well, that's a really good approach, though, because you don't want to write the whole score and then have the director go, well, I don't even like your main themes. If you get some of that stuff out in the beginning and say, hey, this is the direction I'm feeling. What do you think? And then you can work on shaping that towards, their feedback. But if you just start out writing the whole film and going, here you go, and that's just the worst approach you could take.
It is. And then the other side of the coin to that, too, as well, what I find one of the more difficult things to do is when they actually include a temp track. Because the problem is they get married to that music, and you can wind up having to get to a point where you go, look, I can't plagiarize this music because you really fell in love with those tracks, and it's almost like you want me to duplicate those tracks because I'll get things that are really close. But temp tracks can be really challenging because I think that directors already have an idea of what they heard. It's almost like maybe if they give you a temp track and you could come back a year later and do the film, then maybe you would be okay. You know what I mean?
Oh, I'd love that. But you're right, because what happens is it's not just like they give you a song list or they give you a copy of the film with some music in it. It's that they're editing the film with that same music over and over, and it becomes the soundtrack. So now nothing that you can do is going to match what has been burned into their brain as the soundtrack of the film.
Yeah, it's really difficult. I mean, I find that temp tracks are real difficult, but then sometimes you get some projects and then it's like you have to have the temp track just because, the ideas that you throw out there, the filmmaker's just never happy with. And they're going, I really just listen to the temp track and that's where I want to go. And so then, then the challenge is trying to do something that, sounds similar, but, to try to make your own spin on it and make it not sound exactly like the original music.
Right. And the bigger questions too, because you can go a lot deeper with that and say, well, what is it that you like about the temp track? Is it the tempo? Is it the instrumentation? Is it the emotion? Is it the drive? It's not just give me a song that I can kind of replicate the feel of. It's why are you picking that song? And maybe I can do something that's completely different, but gives you that same feel that works more cohesively with the rest of the score.
Yeah, and I have actually, you're right. And I've actually asked that question a couple times. I did have a few times I had that temp track, and, the answers that I got inevitably, just led me back to the original song because, sometimes they don't know. I mean, sometimes it's just a gut feel that they have.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think I had talked to a guy who was a really good filmmaker, and he had told me that when he actually made film, that while he was actually, he would write the script and he would go out and he would actually start filming it. And while he was filming his movie, he would actually be playing music that he thought was relative, like while the scene was actually going on. So that he could get an idea of how he thought that would be. So he had an idea very early about how he thought, the music would work, what it would sound like, and that sort of thing, even before even before the film was done being filmed.
Oh, wow. I like when they have an idea of what they want, but there's another problem with the temp track. And let's say that you're working on the score and they add a scene in and they say, okay, I really like Born to Be Wild. Like I really want a Born to Be Wild thing here. And you go, okay, but this is an orchestral score and we're not in a bar. We're not driving in a car. We don't have anywhere where incidental music would apply. So now how am I going to work this into an orchestral score and put this drive-in rock song in? How do you make that work? And that's another challenge with temp music because they don't have to follow any flavor at all. They can just pick whatever songs and stick them in there.
Yeah, that's, I always, I think for me, there's only two kinds of soundtracks, and I try to work with directors on one or two ideas. And that is either what you're talking, where every single piece is where it's eclectic, like there is no two matching pieces, because otherwise, exactly what you're talking about, if your whole entire, unless it's a comedy, but otherwise, if your whole entire film is orchestral and then you're looking for Born to Be Wild to be put in there, then it kind of disrupts. I think it can make the audience kind of like feel disconnected from the film then. And so I think that's a byproduct of that. However, I mean, if all the pieces are different, that's fine. Then that's fine. But that's something you got to figure out up front. But the other type of soundtrack, of course, my favorite kind of soundtrack is soundtrack that has glue, and you establish some glue between the pieces by finding some commonality, whether it be through motifs or melody or instrumentation, especially with the instrumentation, trying to, settle on that whole sonic bed that you want to deal with, and then create that glue between scenes by sometimes using 3 or 4 notes that might be the same to display certain types of emotions or certain things. And then all of a sudden, I just think it works better for making the viewer feel connected to the film.
Absolutely. I'm curious. I remember the first film that I worked on, because when you're thinking about becoming a film composer, you watch a film, you watch Jaws or Raiders of the Lost Ark or any of these classic John Williams films that we grew up on, and you go, oh yeah, I think that'd be fun to do. And then the first time you get a film and there's no music in there, you're like, wait a minute. I've never seen a film presented in this way, and I'm responsible for all of that. That can be a pretty daunting task. Do you remember the first time that you worked on a film like that?
I can't remember my first film. I would have to go back and look. But I do remember, you're right, early on where I was struggling a little bit because, well, for one thing, I had always wanted to do music on film, but I had always played in bands. And so it took me a real long time. I made a lot of mistakes before I realized that you got to really disconnect your idea of like regular band music or just regular music from film music, because the purpose is different, and you got to really kind of disconnect your idea of how that works, but the other problem I had was, and kind of the same thing maybe directors have with watching film, is that I remember the film scores, that, whether it was Psycho or, or what it was, Taxi Driver, or just a whole bunch of those old movies that I'd watched and the way that they sounded. And then I was also thinking about the way that modern film sounded, and I was trying to kind of connect the two, and I didn't really do a very good job at it. So it was a little bit daunting from that. And I don't know about you, but one of the things I struggled with as well was making too much music and making it too long.
Yeah.
So, I thought, I really, really made I remember I had worked on this one film, and my God, I made this piece of music, and, it was probably, I don't know, maybe, wound up being 4 minutes long or something. And it probably could have been accomplished in maybe 45 seconds or a minute or something, for the scene.
Yeah.
And so I think that was really a struggle, as well for me, that kind of, but then I don't know. I mean, you know how it goes. The longer you do it, the more of a feel you start to have for it,
Yeah, the thing is that when you're thinking about getting into that world and you listen to the scores, you go, yeah, I would have done that, or I see why they did that. But then when you go to sit down to write, you haven't learned how to write for film music. And I think that's why a lot of people fail, is that if you're a songwriter, you're taking your songwriter mentality into it. You haven't really learned to take feedback because no one's ever had to give you feedback on your music, which is a whole nother level. There's a lot of components to scoring films that I don't know about you, but when I started doing it, I didn't even think about. And then I had to learn those lessons very quickly.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, that was a real, I had probably spent, the first 2 years just making mistakes more than anything else. I would say that the first 2 years were just full, but I mean, I learned from them, which was good. And of course the other side is, because when you're dealing with, whether you're dealing with shorts or when you're dealing with indie films and their budgets are so low, you're not just a composer. The other side of that equation that, people like you and I had to really spend time on learning is the production side, because they don't have the money you don't get to go out and hire a bunch of musicians to actually play what it is that you scored. You have to create that, and then you have to create something that sounds, aesthetically pleasing, and also in a case of orchestration that sounds as real as you can possibly make it. And so that's a whole nother craft in and of itself, and takes, I probably in the first, 3 years at least, I probably spent just as much time learning how to work on instrumentation and the production side as I did the actual composing side.
Oh yeah, and you have to be the audio engineer. You have to be the mastering engineer. I've even dubbed the films before, where you take the music and the dialogue track and the effects tracks and you mix them all together for the film. You get called upon to do sound design and all kinds of things that really are beyond. But in indie film, you kind of expect that everybody has to jump in and do whatever they need to do.
Yeah, I've actually been, I've only actually lost 2 film opportunities because I don't actually do sound editing and sound design. I mean, I spend so much time. I mean, I work so hard on the soundtracks that I work on, and they take me so long. I mean, I could spend hours on 7 seconds if something wasn't right. But, it's, to me, there's just not enough time for me to learn to do those other things, because as I go, I mean, I'm still, even now, I mean, I learn every film I work on. I learn something else, and I learn something about the music, and I learn something about the process, and I inevitably learn something about myself.
That's great. Even after all the work, I feel the same way. And I just hit over 1,100 pieces of music that I've written now. And I'm still, everything that I work on, because it's a new composition, it's a new angle, new blend of sounds, I'm still learning as a writer. But I think the one advantage that I had going into it was that I was a classical composer before I became a film composer. I'd already written several symphonies, some concertos, some piano pieces. And so I felt going into film, I had a real advantage that I think a lot of people that are getting into it now don't.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think because I had always, I mean, I have a very eclectic taste of listening to music. So I had always really loved classical music, but I had never really played classical music. I mean, I had played a little, but, not professionally, but, just for myself. But, in bands, I mean, mainly I'd played, fusion style, rock style, metal style, whatever, I mean, I've been a guitar player since I was 8. And so everything that I did was kind of oriented towards guitar. And so when I started doing this, I had to, I know where all the notes are on a piano. I know where all the chords are. I know the scales. I know all of that stuff, the modes and everything. I had to kind of sit down and reconstruct how I thought about music when I, played the keyboard. And then as I started to think about each instrument, I would go online and actually, like, for example, like a cello, go online and find out how a cello player actually approached playing their instrument, so that I knew that if I'm composing a piece that a cello player has to play or would play, then I don't want it to be something that's based off of a piano or guitar.
Mm-hmm.
I want it to, that's part of the instrument sounding natural, is to actually know how a player plays the instrument. And so, so that took a lot. And I'm still learning some of that when I approach a new instrument that I've never done before, is to actually try to figure out how would the player go about playing that instrument.
Right. And you can look back on it too. Like I look at some of the first pieces that I wrote and I look at them and go, oh yeah, my flute player needs to breathe. They can't play all of that. And so I've tried to, as I grew, that's one of the things that really stuck with me, is the reality of the instrument. If it's not going to be performed live, it's probably not that big of a deal in a film, but I still like to have it right. I like to be able to listen back and know that could be performed if I wanted it to be.
You're right. And I think plus you have to think about the fact that I think the way that people play instruments is part of the realism that you attach to it. Mm-hmm. So the closer that you actually mimic how that, if you're playing a cello piece on a keyboard, you could go crazy and play it all kinds of different ways, or even on a guitar, right? It doesn't matter, but the way you approach those instruments is different. So if your goal is to make that instrument sound real, then you want to know how the musician that plays that instrument plays, so that when you're actually playing it on your keyboard or your guitar or whatever instrument it is that you have synthesized, to actually come as close to that. To me, I think it kind of enforces the reality of what you're trying to sound like.
I would absolutely agree with that. I started, it's very common for me to take a pad that's like a 60-piece string orchestra or string section and then use that. But then I started underlaying that with a couple of individual soloists, because your entire string section is not going to start and stop every note at exactly the same time with the exact same amount of smoothness or vibrato. So I started adding in a couple of single players to give it a little bit more of a realistic human sound.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think I think layering it. Layering is something that I've been doing for the past, 4 years or so, 3 or 4 years and more. It seems like the longer I do this, the more I layer. And some of it is, now I've even gotten to the point where I layer some things that aren't even heard. They're just felt, just to add to the feel of it. But yeah, I think that I think I agree with that completely, because you can sit there and play. Say you've got some software that'll do 130 strings, and you sit there and you play it and it sounds great and everything else. But then you're like, well, how could I, that sounds really good, but at the end of the day, it's still software. What can I do to enhance the sound and maybe make it sound, even more real? For me, even since I know everybody likes to, make sure that they're, all their MIDI notes are perfect on time and everything else. I weave in and out of that. So, sometimes I do, especially when it comes to percussive things. I do want the instruments to be, exactly on the note that they should be on, or if you're doing something like an ostinato or something. But if you're playing an instrument, for example, I go back to the cello. If you're playing a cello or you're playing a piano or violin or whatever, I don't want it to be perfect, because if it is perfect, then you lose the human element of it. So I get to the point where I play it as perfectly as I can, but then I never correct it. And so then I think that kind of adds to that whole realism feel.
Oh, absolutely. Taking out the digital perfection and playing like a human being definitely makes a big difference in it. And it doesn't have to be, anything that's even noticeable. It can just be felt.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And I think it's cool that you say that, because I think as composers, we're always looking for little things that we can do to actually make our music sound better. Mm-hmm. I think that after a while, we never stop learning about, emotions and scenes and things like that. But I think after a while, once you've been doing it as long as you and I, you got a pretty good feel for that part of it, like the normal composing part of it. I mean, I know for me at least, I mean, I feel like for me, when I'm working on a scene, I'll know when the composing's really starting to feel right, because all of a sudden everything just kind of drops in.
Yeah.
It's like I'm sitting there and I'm working on a piece and, oh my God, I'm trying all these different, melodies or notes, or, it depends on whether it's, what kind of tempo it is or what you're trying to accomplish, whether I'm starting with, something that's percussive or something that's melodic or something that's just chordal. And, depending on the scene, you sit there and you spend all this time, but then, all of a sudden everything clicks and you get the feeling and you go, okay, it's just falling into place. This is the way I'm going to go. And then once you have that direction, now you know where you're going to go. I think, at least for me, I mean, I don't know about for you, but at least for me, where the more difficult part comes in is in after you've figured that out, and after and when you start to put an arrangement for that together, and then you want to know, what are some things that I can do that will really enhance the sound of this? All of those little things that, like before, like a thing I like to do now is that I've done since a film I worked on recently, is that I'm starting to take like deep reverb effects and actually turn my channel for some low bass instruments off completely and running them through a pre-fader, so they go to the effects before they ever even, they never even come out of the other side of the channel, and just take all the top frequencies off. And then because the volume isn't that high, it's like you don't really hear it, but you can feel it.
Yes.
And you know what I mean? So it's like I'm always like, I learn more about that now, I think, those things, than I do about the actual composing process itself.
Yeah, I tend to do that too. I think we've just gotten maybe comfortable enough with the composing side of it, or at least once we get to that point within a project where we've hit that spot you're talking about, where we can start going, okay, now I can experiment a little bit now that I'm over that initial hurdle. But I do the same thing, and sometimes I'll send the reverb to a bus and use just the reverb as an individual instrument, and not put but very little of the actual instrument at all, and it really creates an interesting effect.
Yeah, and that's basically exactly, we're talking about the same thing, and that's what I really love doing, that because when you just hear the reverb, and in this case, and I was talking about low frequencies. And let's say it's frequencies that come up to, I don't know, like maybe 60 or 80 hertz, and then they just top off and then they kind of disappear. Mm-hmm. Then it's really nice because it adds this, because actually the dB level is about the same as the other instruments, but you don't really hear it. You don't hear it at all, because it's just it's almost like you're putting some fog inside of your music. You're kind of like, mm-hmm. You're just filling it up with fog because you want it to be thicker and fatter and bigger, Exactly.
And, you were talking about the perfection of music earlier. Yeah, I think it's so expected that because of the production capabilities today, that everything should be exactly on the beat. And I can tell a lot of times when something was not played by people, when it was programmed, it's not about how good it sounds. It's about the playability of it. If every single hi-hat sounds exactly the same, then that's not a human hand playing it. And if it is, I don't want to hear that musician. I want some feel in there. I want a little bit of groove. And if you go back and you listen to the music of the 70s, you listen to bands like King Crimson, they're not exactly 100% together all the time. Sometimes they're a 16th or a 32nd note off from each other. And that, to me, is one of the biggest charms of listening to that music, is because it was played by people.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that imperfection creates perfection. Mm-hmm. I think it always does. And like for me, as I said, I mean, I pick and choose the things that wind up being perfect. The things that wind up being perfect are normally things that are associative with being more in the background. The things that are imperfect are the things that are more towards the front of the music.
Right.
And so then it creates, so the stability is created in the background, and then the feel is created in the front, and so, and that's, that's kind of like the near and far of it. And then, like I said, the other things are just created just strictly, or just things that you feel and you don't hear. And so once you start to put those together, you almost create this whole 3D dimensional paradigm of music that you're listening to.
Well, let's talk about that. I'm really glad that you said that, because I think as a composer and as an audio engineer, one of the biggest and most important tools that we have that really doesn't get talked about a lot is panning.
Yeah, I mean, I think that panning, and now, the funny thing about panning is now, mostly what I will do, because you got to understand, so the films that I work on, a lot of those go to film festivals. Right. And because they go to film festivals, I can tell you right now that a lot of the theaters that they could be shown in will have subpar sound systems.
Yeah.
And I've experienced that myself. Matter of fact, I learned a lesson early on. I worked on this one film, and I did all the panning to where it sounded exactly where I thought everybody should be standing. Because I said, I want to make this as real as possible. And then when I got there and I watched the film, it was like, it's like one side of the theater was louder than the other, because, even with the dialogue and everything else, because they had a crappy sound system.
Yes.
And I learned a lesson, and I said, I'll never make that mistake again. I mean, if I get to work on a really big budget film, then I'm going to do things the way I think this should be done with panning. But because of the nature of where these films show, I pretty much try to keep everything out of the middle. I go for, and then what happens is I've got a 50, a 75, a 80, and about a 90, and a few things that I do mid-side. But for the most part, I try to make sure the music can be heard, the same instruments on both sides, just because I know that they're going to wind up in a theater like that. They're going to wind up in a theater that, unfortunately, that's the byproduct of being a part of film festivals, is that's out of your control. What I do though, is that, when on one side, I will create kind of a little bit of a scooped version on the master bus on one side. So at least if you do have a sound system, and this works really well, that is decent, then you do hear a difference between left and right. Even though, let's say, the violin is playing on both the left and right side, or rototoms are playing on both left and right side, then, still there's a different sound just because of the EQ's different on the other side. But unfortunately, I'm kind of strapped by, I'm worried about these substandard sound systems. And so therefore I don't really pan the way I'd like to pan.
Well, and it's tough because that same soundtrack is going to go on a potential DVD release. It's going to be streamed. It's going to the festivals. It may end up on Netflix. And how do you mix for, mixes have to be done for each individual avenue.
Well, they do. That's the other thing is I have to go back. So, by the time I'm done, and once I'm sure that the director is happy and the sound guy is happy with the music, I have to go back and remix it all over again.
Right.
Because now I have to mix it to be listened to instead of a part of a film. And then you're right. Then that's when I take panning into, consideration is, and then I just try to use that rule of thumb of, if I can close my eyes and picture, where each instrument is, then that's where I try to pan to.
It's almost like, and maybe it's because I've got experience as a live sound engineer, but I almost want to follow the film around and go mix it everywhere it plays so that I get the right, the right mix for the room.
Yeah. I mean, I do take, one of the things I've started doing a lot is that I do take one mixed down clean bus copy and then just bring the volume like so stinking low it can barely be heard, and then just compress the hell out of it so that it's just like a stupid amount of compression,
Mhm.
just so that it adds a little bit of grit to it in case it needs to cut through some, some bad speakers, or, if you're looking, or if there's smaller speakers and you want to make sure that you have some, some bass notes in there or whatever. But, using a little bit of, parallel compression like that goes a long ways towards, and of course, if it's on a really good stereo, then it doesn't matter anyway, right? I mean,
Right,
if it's on
yeah.
a really good, you didn't, no harm, no foul, because you've got it buried so low that it really doesn't do anything.
Yeah, and if people are streaming it on YouTube, listening through earbuds, good luck anyway. It's only going to get so good.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, there's that automatic compression when you upload anything to YouTube. The files are compressed, so the audio is going to suffer to an extent just on that alone. It's almost like you have to overplay it so that the compression will put it where you wanted it to be in the first place. But if you try to do that, you're probably going to distort or burn out somewhere in the score.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, it's a tough line.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I am looking forward to the day that, I can actually work on a film where they go, you know what, make the sound, we're going to make sure this is on a good 5.1, sound system. And, we're only going to be on, we're going to be on Netflix or Hulu or whatever the case may be. And, or we're going to be out in, just good theaters and so forth. So, so just keep that in mind. And then I know how to do it. I just don't get to do it,
I actually want to get to the point where I just hear, just give us the stems. Okay. You can mix it. You can master it. You can do all of that. I'll just write it and export it and I'll be happy.
Yeah, I do like that idea, but I also kind of like the idea. I don't know. I was watching, what's his name? Is it Deadmau5? I think the guy who does the electronic music production, and he was actually talking about that. And he was saying that, a lot of the guys that he works with, when they're done, they'll send their stems out and, their music, and then they will actually have them mixed and mastered themselves. He said, but, he goes, it's something that I learned how to do. He goes, I prefer to just do it myself, because I took the time to learn how to do it.
I can see that, but I think it's just more to me, the novelty of it, of not having to be responsible for any of that, to just for once, just, here's everything, do what you're going to do with it and be happy. But I think that I would probably be so paranoid that they're not doing the right accents, that they're not panning it properly, that there's not enough depth. I mean, there's a million things I would sit there and go, they're probably not doing that right.
Yeah, I think so. I think probably, I mean, if I could pick and choose that way, I would probably say I would probably like to just, I would probably like to mix it and then send it out to be mastered. Because the mastering process is just such a whole other ball of wax, it just really is.
Yeah, and a film can have an hour of music in it, and that's a lot of mastering that needs to be done on that much audio.
Yeah, it really is. So, and I don't want to get away from, I know that this, and I don't want to get away from too, that I get so far into production that I forget about how challenging and how much, when you're composing a film, when, if we kind of digress a little bit and talk about the composing again, is that, one of the things that happens for me is that I will work on a scene until all of a sudden I feel something emotionally one way or another. And so, that's really if it wasn't for that, I don't think that I would even be doing it. So I think that's the biggest thing, when you sit there and you labor over ideas until you finally get to this point that it affects you. And then once it affects you, then that, or you hope that it will affect other people who watch it.
Oh, absolutely. And I want to ask you what your first one was that you recall really feeling that with. For me, it was the first Star Wars movie that came out, which was actually episode 4, when Ben Kenobi and Darth Vader are having the fight and they're trying to get to the Falcon. That music that they played, that John wrote, with the string section just swelling up as soon as the lightsaber hits the ground. That was the first time I went, wow, I really felt something with that music. And I was pretty young. I think Star Wars came out in 75, 70, 78, I think. So I would have been like
Yeah.
6 years old.
I think it was 77, actually.
77. Okay. Yeah. And so that I was pretty young to connect that to the score. Do you remember maybe what was one of your first times that you really honed in on that?
I think, what's kind of funny is that one of the scenes that really kind of got me was, everybody always talks about Psycho. And of course they talk about the shower scene.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, one of the pieces of music that really kind of struck me was actually when she had left Arizona and she had the money and she was driving in a car and there was, a police car behind her. And of course, Herman had created this music that kind of fluttered up and down a little bit. And it had these little momentary, I don't want to say breaks, but almost like, it's almost like a stop and a start again. And I thought, God, I could feel like I could feel like she was feeling, I could feel the tension of what she was feeling. And I go, God, it's just so brilliant. It's just so perfect. I mean, it just like if you just saw the scene with no music, I don't know that you would have felt really that tension. I think it was the music that really, and so I just thought, oh God, that's just so cool. I really love the way that made me feel how the character felt.
Well, see, and the other thing too, like you mentioned earlier, you're talking about whose voice are you following? That scene could have been written as the police officer. It could have been written as her perspective. It could have been the view of somebody standing to the side of the road, watching them drive by. And you really have to know how to write for the character and what's going on in the scene so that you're really directing the viewer as to whose story you're following.
Yeah. And that get back, and as we're talking about before, that really gets back to point of view, because that point of view really defines how you're going to approach that particular scene.
Yeah, I agree. And for anyone who just knows the shower scene in that movie, that part of the Psycho Suite is pretty cool. That just, shrill, repetitive strings. But that entire Psycho Suite is actually a very beautiful piece of music.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much good music inside of there that did so many different things. And I mean, of course, he was the master anyway. But, that music is amazing for that whole soundtrack.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that was when film score was really beginning to take shape, as opposed to just being filler or background. That's probably around the time I would say things were starting to get more focused.
Yeah, I would say so too. I would agree with that.
Yeah. And then it just obviously took off from there with guys like John Williams coming into the scene and, it's just amazing. But one thing, I had this dream that one day a theater will be designed to where there's a multi-level speaker system in the ceiling, and it will actually direct sound to where that sound is on the screen. So like you were talking about 3D earlier, like a full 3D audio experience where, I mean, you could control it to like an inch of the theater.
Yeah. And I actually thought that somebody had done that already. Actually, oh. I thought that I had heard somebody, maybe I'm wrong, but I thought that I had heard that somebody had designed a speaker system that was actually behind a very thin screen. And so the music was coming from behind the screen in the places that it happened. But I'm not sure. Maybe they were also, full of crap too. So.
Well, and then of course it comes down to the astronomical cost of making that happen and upgrading a theater and that sort of thing. But I think that would be neat to really have like a full immersive experience. And but panning that out, plotting the sound to go where it needs to go, and then it depends on where you're seated.
Yeah,
what your experience is going to be like. So I don't know. But I think it would be an interesting experiment. I don't know in reality how well that would play out.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Yeah, well, my mind just goes where it goes. I take no responsibility for what my brain comes up with. So now the last couple of films that you've worked on, what kind of films were they?
Well, I'm glad you asked about that. So I actually had said so I had mentioned Planet George, which was a comedy, which was a feature length, and that was actually a pretty darn good film. And that's actually, they're looking for distribution for that right now.
Oh,
So we'll see how that goes. I worked on a short for Rick Gutierrez that's called Stay.
oh yeah, Rick's a good guy.
Yeah, yeah, and so that's kind of a, it's a kind of a, I want to say psychological thriller, but maybe not. It's kind of like it's got a little bit of voodoo in it, and it's got a little bit of love in it, and then it's got some tension in it, and then some bad mojo, you know. So that it's kind of, so that was really interesting to work on. And then I worked with Sheila Patterson on a short that she's going to be showing in LA, actually, the LA Film Festival. And that's called Love Drug. And Sheila's quite young, but she's like, I think she's going to make a lot of noise. Like, I really do. I mean, you know, I just think she's going to make a lot of noise in the industry. But that was a psychological thriller, and that was very interesting. The music is, she's a director who likes the idea of the sound of the music more than music itself. And so I kind of learned some things working with her on that, because, you know, she had a complete different idea about how things should be. And so that was, so I've either wrapped that up or I have one more small piece on that. And so, and then I worked with Jamie Rivera on a horror called Finally You, which I'm very proud of that soundtrack. I think that it was really, it kind of like if you took Friday the 13th and Basic Instinct and kind of put those together, that's what that soundtrack sounds like.
Oh, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, and with a little bit of modern flair. And Jamie, it's a very unique film, and I know Jamie's very proud of it as well. And so that's going to be premiering here local soon, and then he's going to ship that off to some festivals. So that's the last ones that I worked on. And then right now I'm working on a feature-length film. I'm working on two. And one is by, I don't know if you know, Kevin Phipps.
Oh, yeah.
So Kevin's making a feature horror right now called, it's the Dr. Seville Horror Show. And that's actually quite interesting, because it's like 3 stories that are separate that are going to have a wraparound.
Oh,
and
nice.
So, yeah, so it's very interesting to work on. I worked with Kevin before on another film called My Secret War. And Kevin's a really, really talented director as well. And, you know, I mean, Kevin is a different cat, because he's almost like the guy that you feel like that he was maybe directing films in Hollywood for a long time, and then maybe he just moved here or something, you know, or he ran away
Right,
or something,
yeah.
right? Because Kevin is just, he's really has that kind of a feel for making movies, you know, he really does. And then I'm working on another one right now at the same time. I'm about halfway through. I'm hoping that it'll be finalized by middle of March. And that's for feature also. Quite a different the film, I think, was finished about 4 or 5 years ago, and it's called Endless Flight. And it's actually directed by a friend of mine, Everett Scott Ortiz, who lives in New Mexico, produced by Laura Braga. And it's actually a film about 6 survivors of a plane crash. So, you know, if you could picture a actual commercial flight, and there's a crash and everybody is on board, is killed except for these 6 people. And then they have a lot to kind of come to grips with after it. Because, you know, there's just, I mean, if you can imagine, there's just so many different kinds of emotions and things that you would have to go through from that, whether it's feeling guilty because you're one who actually was alive, or, you know, actually feeling, you know, maybe a bit selfish because you wanted to be alive, or, you know, and then feeling bad for, you know, the people that you were sitting beside that you didn't know that wound up dying. And that, so it's kind of about the process that they go through, trying to deal with, and then a self-discovery that they make about themselves because of that. So that's the 2 films that I'm working on right now in this moment.
That's I really like that concept. I think that there is so much that you can do from an emotional aspect with those characters. And obviously that just brings you all kinds of opportunities as a composer. But when you find that the actors are giving you a lot, do you tend to lay back a little bit on the music and let their performance shine through? Or do you like to really enhance it with something strong?
Well, actually it's funny because I think a lot of times, a director will have a style and then I kind of go with that style because I would say 50% of the time, I kind of actually think that a scene should be different than what a director thinks it should be. Yeah. But at the end of the day, I really want to kind of explore the idea of what it is that they're looking for and try to accommodate that. And everybody has a different idea too about, for example, Kevin, I had mentioned Kevin, and Kevin really likes minimalism, and he's a minimalist. I'm sorry, not a mentalist. He's a minimalist.
A minimalist, yeah.
And, yeah. But, within that, though, he likes to let people who work with him, explore their own creativity. So I'm not saying that he's a person who says, oh, it just has to be minimal. That's the way it is. Because that's not the way he is at all. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's a very open person, and he tries to allow everybody, whether it's actors or, composers or anyone, the idea to express themselves with their own creativity. But he certainly has a concept and an idea of kind of like the way he likes, for example, like the way he likes music to affect his films. And he and I, that's one of the reasons he and I get along so well, because I like working with people who, have an idea and then they kind of develop a style within themselves. Even if they don't know it, they develop a style within themselves. So the second and third and fourth time you work with these people, as you go around, you kind of know what to expect, and it kind of makes the job a little bit easier,
Oh, absolutely. And it just gets better the more projects you do together. The challenge then becomes not getting stale and just staying within those confines of what you've developed and not ever branching out.
Yeah, I mean, I have that's a very good statement. I have a guy that I work with named Rustin Odom, who's a filmmaker here in town, and he's really good at sci-fi. And the thing is with Rustin is he always has an idea of, he may not have an idea of what, he doesn't know exactly what music he wants because he doesn't know musical instruments or that sort of thing. But he has a very real idea of kind of like what kind of a feel and tone and that kind of thing. And it is always kind of a building thing, when he and I work on something. So we kind of build that beginning afresh and, till we kind of get it. And then once you get it kind of clicked in, then it makes scoring the rest of the film so easy, and I like working with people like that.
Well, and the nice thing too is that when you start your next project, you're not starting with any uncertainty. You might be uncertain about how the project itself is going to go, but that's just the confines of the project. You're comfortable working with that director because you've been through the growing pains already, at least the majority of them.
You're right about that. I mean, it's establishing that first line of communication, because since most directors are not musicians, they each have their own language. That's one of the things I learned getting into this business. I didn't realize. I thought that, there would be like this dictionary of these standard acronyms that everyone would use. Mm-hmm. And what I found out is it's not that way at all.
Yeah.
Every director has his own language that he talks with. It's up to you as a composer to actually find, it's almost like being a translator, where it's almost like you have to translate that language into something that you can identify with. And then once you do that, now all of a sudden, then, now you can make the music for that person.
Well, right. And you have to be part psychologist to bring some of that out sometimes, because they won't necessarily know how to express what it is that they're wanting. And so you have to play 20 questions and you have to get in their head and try and figure out how to flesh out what it is that they mean so that you can start learning to work together.
Yeah. There's some of that. And then, there's also some of I think that I find that most of the time, the first time through, it's like kind of like the first time you talk about a scene that maybe you don't quite get the answers you're looking for, and you almost have to go back and revisit it again. Like I don't ever think that scenes and films are ever about one conversation, or one evening of conversation.
Right.
They turn into one long evening of conversation, perhaps maybe another evening of long conversation, who knows? And then as you go along, it turns into, conversation back and forth over and over again, because it kind of grows a little bit, or as you said, maybe that's, maybe I'm just ineffective on that psychologist pointing, getting that exactly out of them. But I think that what I think I know, I don't know, I kind of figure
right.
out as I go. So,
and you'll find out when you start submitting music and they're like, yeah, that's what I wanted. Or, no, you really missed the point, but you have to realize too, as a film composer, if you don't have a good, solid understanding of the film, you can completely change the entire film. I realized when I was working on a student films like 10 plus years ago, that when I wasn't able to spot the film with the director, so he sent it to me and I watched it, and he goes, well, give me a call tonight and let me know what you thought. So I'm watching this film and I couldn't tell what the film was about, and I couldn't tell what style of film it even was. And I realized at that point, within minutes, I could make that film a comedy, a drama, or a horror, just because the film itself didn't really speak enough volume. And I had the ability to change the entire face of that film with music.
Yeah, and that's a pretty amazing thing. I mean, I can't say that I've worked on a film that was quite that wide open. I have worked on some films that, are somewhat wide open, as you say. But I mean, you're right. It's like and I've actually done that, where I've actually like guessed a scene wrong, from the standpoint of, what they were actually looking for. And they were looking for something that was, diametrically opposed to that. And you're right, you run into that. I mean, it's just like, and because again, it gets back kind of like to those elements we talked about, right? It's like feel, point of view, tempo, all of those things. Because I have some, basic rules, as I'm sure you've created your basic rules as you went along with. And, I try to, apply those basic rules in my thinking. For example, if a scene is, kind of lacking in energy, then I try to up the tempo a little bit, because, so to actually give it energy. Or if I want, to shorten the scene, if I want the scene to be longer, let's say, they've got a scene that's a minute or a minute and a half, and I want it to seem like it's, 3 minutes long, so that the audience feels that way, then I'll just really slow the tempo of the music way down.
Right.
And all of a sudden it makes that scene seem longer. I mean, all of those little things that we kind of develop as composers that are our own little things we have, but then you just wind up, maybe not being, cohesive with the director. And that's why you got to continue to have that conversation back and forth.
Right. And, I'm really glad that we're having this conversation, because it reminded me of a couple of other things, like learning how to read the actors and decide, the actor I don't really think is giving enough to push this scene. I think we need to drive the music a little bit, not in tempo necessarily, but just in pulse or in, not pulse, but like in instrumentation or something. And then you contact the director, hey, can we revisit this scene really quick and have that dialogue? And because they might not have noticed it either.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's, and actually, I could say, one of the things about with, the directors that I work with, because I've established, a rapport with them, is, one of the cool parts about it is they actually ask me about their film. Like, before I'm even doing music, like they said, well, how do you like, what do you think? And I will just be honest. I have that relationship with them, and I can go, I really thought that scene, like, it just didn't have the the ending I was looking for, or, you went on, maybe I thought you went on too long for this or what. So, I mean, for me, I'm lucky as a composer that way, because the directors I work with actually will listen to my input, and they solicit my input on, because it's not a fully edited film yet.
Right.
I see it when it's in its early stage. So I get to make comments. That kind of helps me, because then they kind of they go, I was kind of thinking about that a little bit myself. So, and then they go back and they kind of recut the thing or whatever, so that kind of helps me from that standpoint.
Well, and that helps really build that relationship for two reasons. One, they know that you're seeing those things, that you're picking up on that, which means that you're really focused on their film, paying attention, and you have the skills. And two, they know that you're not afraid to open up that dialogue and say, hey, I think something's not right here. Let's make sure everything's okay before we can go forward. I want this film to be the best it can be for me and for you and for everyone.
Yeah, they really do. And, and I actually kind of changed my whole idea about, composing for films, and even more so recently, in the fact that, I was doing so many for a while, and I think I've done like 30 of them now or something. I lost track on how many I've done. But anyway, I was so concerned with, I was obviously learning and trying to do the best job that I could, but then I also, I was so concerned about just trying to make it the living that I was looking for it to be, that, I was thinking about the money a lot. And so I just got to the point where I said, I just don't like that anymore, because it's not moving the needle for me, and so I kind of revisited that and turned around and said, I'm not going to think as much about the money anymore. I want to think about the opportunity to work with people who really, really, really are looking to be at beyond the top of their game. People who are really quality and who really have that drive and desire to be as good as they can possibly be, and are talented. And I feel like in the last few movies that I've worked on, and in the movies going forward, I feel like that's really starting to pay off for me from my own personal level.
Well, sure. And I think that it can be depressing when you're trying to turn your art into a business, and no matter how many compliments you get, no matter how many people are coming to you for work, the money's not there, and you can run the risk of really starting to hate what you're doing, because it's not coming to fruition the way that you want it to. And that's a hard thing to balance.
Yeah. I agree with that. And the other side, there's two sides of that, or two pieces of that too. The other piece is when you're working on a film and you feel like maybe you care about it more than they do. And that's, when you get to that point, man, that's a really bad feeling. Like, I really hate that feeling.
Yeah, I think that's probably the worst thing I experienced in all the projects that I've worked on, is that. And when you feel like you're carrying it and the director's not returning your calls, or they're just kind of blowing off your feedback on the scenes, like, you kind of feel like, why am I putting anything into this? Why do I still care about this film? What is it about it or about me that keeps driving me to do it?
Yeah, or even when you get, and for me, the big one too is that as you're working on a film and as they're cutting it and editing it, and then you're getting pieces of it back, and then you're looking at these pieces and you're going, what the hell are they doing? It's like, what are they doing? It's like, and you feel like, I don't know. You could tell that the work's not there or whatever, and you go, they didn't really put so now I care more about their film than they do. And it's like, if I care more about the film than they do, then that's bad news.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's interesting now that you say that, it's just something else just occurred to me. What I used to get would be like a rough cut of the picture, so I could at least get an idea and start developing themes. But I wouldn't actually start working on the final film until they had locked picture, and there really was no more editing other than, like visual effects and sound design and cleanup. Are you working on projects before they're locked?
Oh yeah, I am, just to establish. I get involved as early as I possibly can, because what happens is, and understand that everything that I'm doing early is rough cuts.
Right.
They're all rough cuts. So I'm not doing any kind of music that's going to be locked to exact timing or anything like that, because there's no point in that.
Yeah.
I do take scenes and kind of do some timing. I mean, I kind of lock it in a little bit, but I mean, I've been doing it so long that it's not that hard for me to do. But I do it with the understanding that it's gonna change. You know what I mean? It's gonna change, and so that way, if I get an idea early, and I can get some upfront work done, we can establish the tone and what they want some of the scenes to feel like and sound like. That by the time I get locked at it, then it makes my job a lot easier.
Absolutely. Okay, that's kind of what I thought you did, because I would do that too. I would do some sketching with the rough cut, but I wouldn't really, I might come up with a couple of character themes or overall themes that I really liked. But yeah, nothing was set in stone until I had something to actually sync it to. The other thing that I was going to ask you about, as far as the spotting session goes, that I think is an important thing, because I had a situation that caused me to realize it was important, was to also talk about the visual effects that are going to be added to the film, because that can change the way that you score it.
Yeah, I mean, it can. I mean, I think that and not just visual effects, but also sound effects.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes there's some sound effect, like we'll have a scene and there'll be something that's going, that I don't necessarily even see. And I know when I was working with Rustin on a scene, the guy I was talking about before, and he was saying, oh, well, when you get in here, because I was saying, what are we going to do? We're doing this and that, blah, 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 with music. And then he goes, oh, well, right here, don't worry about it really too much, because, there's going to be this big, loud something or another, blah, 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 and this is going to happen. And I go, oh, okay. So that's, that kind of tells me. And you're right. It's the same thing with because they don't, I don't know how it is with you, but with me, depending on what kind of movie it is, but for example, if it's sci-fi, then there's a lot of green screens in there.
Yes.
When I'm looking at it. And so, for me, what I will do is I usually ask every time I see a green screen, okay, what's in the green, man? I really need to know,
Yeah. I think the most common question I used to ask was, who's covering that? Is it the sound designer? Is it me? Do I need to write around it? And something like a big explosion, you may want to leave a little bit of breathing room in the music to really let the explosion play out and then start the music, or you might want to start the music as the explosion's playing out. Those are conversations that need to be had in that spotting session so that you really know where you're covering and where you're not. Yeah,
I agree. I mean, and and it is, I do try to find out all of those things. I mean, I have a spreadsheet that I use for cues, and I create cues of every scene, and I try to, have a whole note section there that's outside of the other things. Like, I've got, a column for point of view, a column for purpose, column for tempo, blah, blah, blah. But then I do have a note section, because sometimes I do, want to know that something like that's happening. And sometimes, it leads to the conversation about it, not just in explosions, but sometimes with other things where sometimes filmmakers feel like there should be music in pieces and, in a scene, and you go, you know what? I don't really think music belongs here at all.
Right.
And then you have that conversation.
Yeah. And then is it a hard stop? Does it fade out? Is it a short fade, a long fade? Do we need to carry it along till the sun sets? There's so many little things. But I'll tell you why I came across that in my own situation. I was scoring a vampire film. And there's this point where the sun is out and the vampire is caught outside. He's trying to get away. He's got a hoodie on. So, he's trying to protect his skin as much as possible. And he reaches his hand out. And I thought, okay, well, the sun's burning him. And that's what his problem is, because there was no visual effect yet. It was just him holding his hand up. And of course, his hand is perfectly intact because they haven't added anything. And so I scored it with a sort of a sizzly feel to it, because I thought it was the sun scorching his hand. Turns out he got shot. And that's what his problem was. And I'm like, well, I would have scored it completely differently. So that's why those conversations are so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is important to think about those. I know that filmmakers think about details, but certainly composers are almost anal in the way that they think about details on things. I mean, I even think, I don't know how you are, but when I was working on Finally You, which was the horror film, I mean, I spent a lot of times there's a lot of live action fighting that goes on in that film. So it's like almost not martial arts, but certainly it's a lot of high action that goes on in this particular film. And I found myself really paying attention to this loft that these people were in, and how one of the walls had brick, and then where the wood was, and then where were all the lights located and the lamps on the bedstand, and and kind of like what like the kitchen had this really like stainless steel kind of feel to the top, and then the walls were brick or whatever. And I thought, just really, you almost feel like there's this hardcore injection of this cold feeling that you get about the place. It's like one of those places that you would go to, and if you were like, if a friend had a party or something and you fell asleep, you'd wake up and you'd be really, really cold if it was in the dead of winter.
Oh,
And so as I was approaching the music, I mean, that stuff was in my mind. And so some of the instrumentation and some of the drops and some of the arrangement itself and some of the ways that I brought things in and out kind of, and probably the average listener won't even know, but I'll know.
Yeah, but it's kind of like listening to the bass guitar in a rock band. A lot of times you don't hear what the bass guitar is doing, but if you removed it, that song would be really weird. You would really notice it if it wasn't there.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really, I think you just wind up, again, it's all about detail, right? I mean, you can never it's almost like, I know some people say, well, you can have too much detail. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know if I could ever have too much detail,
Right, yeah.
As much detail as you could give me, the better. I think the better my music's going to sound and the better your film's going to look, the more we can think about this stuff, so.
Well, sure, because there could be one infinitesimal little thing that changes the direction of what you would do. There could be one tiny little bit of light cracking through one of the bricks that's just a pinpoint on the screen. But to you, that has a meaning. And now all of a sudden to you, that room is filled with that light, and that's how you're going to score it. And I'm very big on room ambience. The lighting, the camera angles, whether there's like a dust in the air, all those things were so important to me in creating the underscore, because the underscore is underscoring the scene, and the room is so much a part of that scene. You have to talk about it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, I agree. And I think that part of the reason why I get kind of enamored with this whole idea of detail and thinking and a third dimension because I've been working really, really hard on the last 3 or 4 films that I've done, and moving forward on, this whole idea of a new added dimension that I've never had before. Maybe the audience doesn't necessarily hear. That's totally different. And I think that's because I realized about a year ago, I started thinking about this because I thought, it's like when you watch a film and you have the music and the sound and the special effects and the color and the visuals and all of these other things, it's like you get so many of these senses, but the one thing you don't get is smell. You don't get the sense of smell. And, historically, you could be connected to a piece of history by smell, and you remember something. And I thought, that's what's really missing. And so I think with my music, I've got to think about a way to, almost create, a smell inside of the music. I want to create this smell because that's what's missing from the film world is you don't smell anything. All you smell is the theater you're watching it in or your home when you're watching it on your TV. You don't actually get that. That's the one element that's missing from a film.
There is, I want to say it's at the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids thing at Disney, where they do a little bit of that. They like pump a scent in at a certain time. I know they do this. They do blowers under the seat so that it simulates rats. But you're right. And I think that you could do something as simple as, let's say it's the end of a battle and you see these corpses that are charred and you see kind of the smoke coming off of them. And you do it just like a little bit of a shrill sound underneath all of that. You could almost create an audio version of the olfactory sense.
Yeah, I think that's it. And so I'm always looking for, you're right. And so I'm always looking for some way to try to add something, different into, just something that's not there before. And I think a lot of that, I don't know, a lot of, after I'd listened to all of these great scores, by all of these, really great composers. And as you said, whether it's Herman or John Williams or Hans Zimmer or Danny Elfman, or it doesn't matter, any of these guys, I really, really like, something that kind of brought it all together for me was, Trent Reznor, because Trent Reznor is, that's Nine Inch Nails. And so that whole synthesized sound. And so, it's kind of like, it almost touches into the realm of where I started coming into this hat. And so I've really, really been working hard on creating this whole idea of, instrumentation and things that maybe you can't discern and tell what they are. And so you make, you create your own hybrid, the soundtrack to, I know people either love it or they hate it. The soundtrack to the girl with the dragon tattoo.
Oh, yeah.
People either love it or hate it, and it's fine, whatever people think of it. I don't care. But the reason why I liked it is because it's that classic way that Trent Reznor finds all these different ways to introduce these sounds. It's kind of like an injection of all of these different sounds that come into the soundtrack, and then just kind of make it different, and it's real edgy that way. And so I'm always trying to look for a way to add, some kind of a different third dimension to the score.
Right. No, I love that. And I love that you're still searching for things that you haven't gotten so comfortable with it that you're just like, okay, here, now I'm going to add a cello. Now I'm going to add this synth. Now I'm going to add this pad. Now I'm going to add these strings. That you're still wanting to make everything individual and to make the film the best it can be. I mean, our job is to enhance the visual and the audio. That's what we do. But I think a lot of times when a director gives us a change instruction, they don't necessarily think about everything that change will affect. So if you have to change something that's maybe a tempo, well, that might change 3 or 4 other pieces in the score, because now changing that one tempo throws the balance of everything else off. And now we have to go and correct that, which is great. But a lot of times that people tend to think it's a very simple change. All we have to do is this one thing. And they don't realize, well, that's actually going to be another 35 hours of work.
Yeah, I agree with you. And that's why I actually have that happen more often than you might think. And that's why everything that I do early is all so scratch and just rough cut. I mean, there's no mix to it or anything. I mean, something may be louder than it should be. Maybe a stop is out of place. The timing may not be correct, a little bit, but sometimes even I was just working on a scene for Kevin, as a matter of fact, because I wanted to know if there was a piece of the scene where the music would be appropriate. And I completely skipped the whole first part of the scene.
Oh,
I just skipped the whole first, and I told him, I'm just skipping the whole first part of the scene and I'm jumping to here because I need to get your, and the reason why I wanted to do that, is because the scene is kind of elongated, and, whether I pick it up or down will depend on how the feel is there. But I wanted to try to establish the tempo of the elongated scene, and the piece that I wanted to look at was actually much more difficult to compose than the beginning of it. So I just said, I know that I'm going to have an easy time with the beginning, so I'm not going to even work on it.
But that also brings up another challenge too, is it's not just the piece that you have in that scene. It's what comes before it, how it blends in or fades out, what comes after it. How does that piece fit in, not just in that scene, but within the score?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you said that as well, because another piece to that is not only at the end and the beginning, but also is sometimes as you kind of go through the scene, and you have like, I call them like the little leftover pieces or whatever that's in between. Like you may have a scene that say it's going to wind up being the same piece of music, but there might be 15 seconds of the scene where you're really not going to have music, or the music that you have is going to be very thin. Right. And so, you got, as composers, that's what I mean. We have to think about all those details is because you want it to be smooth. You don't want to just go, well, the music comes up to this point because, that's what the director will say. Well, the music's going to come up to this point, and I want you to stop, and we're going to wait right here, and then I want you to start here again. Right. And then it's like, well, but that'll sound like shit, man. So,
Yeah.
But you don't tell them that. You just know. So what you do is you just, like maybe when the music ends, like you say, you have some kind of a fade. Maybe you leave, the oldest trick in the book is like to leave a high note going, right? Some string that's high so the music, even though the main parts of the music stopped, there's still a little tiny piece of that high note that just goes on. And then as it gets, near where the music's going to start up again, unexpectedly, maybe you either change the note or you have it fade out or whatever. And next thing you know, the music's kind of coming back in again,
Right,
but those are those little tricks that we develop, I think, either A, by hearing the masters at work, or B, that we kind of come up with on our own.
Mm-hmm. And I love that we're still experimenting, still finding new ways to do things, because this could easily get very stale if we didn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always about, and again, I think it's always about trying to find some new way of, helping a director tell their story and finding a new way to, express that. Yeah. And, being able to add to your repertoire, being able to add to your toolbox, whether it's on the composing side or the production side, and trying to do everything that you can to learn. I mean, I do every single thing. I don't just go up and watch composers talk about what they do. I go up and watch filmmakers talk about what they do.
Right.
Famous filmmakers, when you hear these guys, certain guys will talk, and then, you kind of get it because, I think that they're being forthright and forthcoming in what they're talking about when they make their films. And then other guys will talk, and then you go, I think he just likes to hear himself talk. So,
Yeah.
You don't really learn anything,
Right. Well, I could talk to you about this for hours, and I know you could too. But I do have one more question for you. In thinking about, how, and we've been doing this for a long time, and things have changed a little bit, but how would you recommend to people to go about initiating, if you want to get into this game? You've got to meet people, you've got to get out there, and you've got to make connections, because no one's going to have you work on their project if they don't have some level of interest in you, or you've, shown them that, hey, I think I would be a good person to work with. I've got some skills. What would you recommend to people if they were getting started now?
Well, I think, the first thing that you got to realize is that you got to go out and cut your teeth. And so, I whether you want to do it online, or whether you want to go to, your local, find your local, independent filmmakers, their organizations or whatever, and find people who are doing, like here, for example, in Arizona, in Phoenix, they do a lot of 48-hour film challenges.
Oh, well. God, do they?
Yeah, they do. So a lot of the people, some of the people who do them are, been making films for a long time, but then people who just start out making films, do a lot of those. And so what you want to do is you want to go find somebody in the beginning who's also just getting started like you, that's a filmmaker.
Right.
So then you just want to go, kind of attach yourself to them, and then go, you know what, dude, I want to get into this. I don't know anybody. I see you're kind of getting started. How would you like, I want to do some music for film. Could I do the music for your film? And, next thing you know, you do that, and, a year has gone by, and next thing you know, maybe you've done 6 or 8 films or something, in the 48-hour film challenge.
Right.
And then hopefully that gets you, at least enough of a name that you can now, if your friends kind of their level rises, then you rise together. If your level goes up and theirs don't, then you find the people at the next level. And
Right.
and eventually you're going to do this so long, if you get good enough at it, people are going to look for you. Then, then that's kind of what you do.
Sure. And word of mouth is big too. But I would agree with everything that you said, but I would add a couple things to it. For one, I think that before you even approach other people to work on their films, especially on a 48-hour film project, because those you have to learn to write and mix fairly quickly. There's a lot of changes that happens, and you find out 20 minutes after the piece was due, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you, we changed the scene on set. And you're like, oh, well, I have to write something really quick, which means I have to mix it and record it really quick. But before you even do that, I would say find some film scoring contests where they give you a piece of video and you write music to it. And don't worry about the contest. Just take that video and practice with it. Learn how to write the tempos, learn how to write so that when you have accents that need to hit a visual, that they hit that visual and you're not just stuck on well, my beat's 100 beats a minute at 4/4. So that's what it is. I hope it works. You really have to learn how to score a scene. So I would say try that a little bit first. Find out if you're really interested in doing it, if that's fun for you. And if it is, then by all means pursue it. If you don't like that part, that's the whole business right there. That's everything.
Yeah. You know what? I didn't think about it from that stage before that. I mean, I think if you're saying from ground zero and you've never even practiced it or anything, I would agree with that. Matter of fact, I think that one of the things that I did early when I was trying to get in, what I did is I went up to, and I forget the website now, but there's a website with all of the old, like black and white silent films and stuff. And so they are freely distributed. I think it's like archive.org or archive.com or something like that. But anyway, I downloaded some of those, like the old silent version of Phantom of the Opera and some of those other ones and some of those movies, and then just turned off because, they have like organ music playing.
Right.
There.
Yeah.
And I just turned off the sound completely and sat there and just started working with ideas about how I would score this thing. And so I actually had real scenes to kind of think about and to score from. And so, yeah, I mean, if you obviously can't go to a 48-hour film challenge if you haven't at least got an idea of how you're going to approach your craft.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you definitely want to do that. So, and you're right, there's a lot of online film challenges, and there's places like, Stage 32 that has a lot of people that are looking to do films that don't have money, that are also, they're not 48-hour film challenges, but they are films that have zero budget. And you'll see right there, it'll say composer unpaid, actor unpaid. I mean, they've got all of that stuff listed right there. And, as a matter of fact, early on, I think what did I do? I did 3 projects off of there, I think, early on Stage 32, because I just needed to get my feet wet.
Yeah. Well, and that's, and to be fair to you, Bruce, I was not very clear in my question. In my mind, I was thinking, like, once you're ready to go, how do you start networking? But as you were saying it, I started thinking about taking a step even further back and saying, oh, before that, here's what you should do. So no, you answered the question beautifully. I think that you bring up some really valid points, and it's great that there are resources out there. I don't know. How do you feel about this? I would not start with films you're familiar with, because I think if you do that, you're going to automatically, subconsciously at least, start scoring them the way that they're already scored. And I think it's better to take a piece of film you've never seen, you're not very familiar with at all, and say, okay, what would I do with this? This is really a blank slate.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea. I think you could do that with some, and I've had people ask me that before in some of the Facebook groups and stuff, like, where's some places I can go to get, things to score to and everything. And I think that's an excellent idea. I think the only reason why the silent films work maybe is because that music is goofy, right? I mean, all the music to the silent films, it's like, if you ever watch Phantom of the Opera, like there's a scene where he's being like really scary and horrible, and they have like some happy music going on in the background.
Well, it's almost like they said, okay, you're going to go out there and you're going to perform live with this film. The film's an hour and a half. Good luck. Just play whatever.
Exactly. But yeah, I think that's a great idea, is to go up and maybe, actually do that, to find some stuff. It doesn't matter where, right? I mean, YouTube or Vimeo or anywhere. I mean, you could find so many different scenes and then, wind up, but you're right. I would say shut the sound off. You've never seen the film. And, if there's music there, I mean, once you hear the music, it's already in your head.
Yeah.
So, almost better just shut the sound off. Even if you just pretend, try to, turn on the closed caption and read what the actors are saying. And then, go back and then try to score to it, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And then for the next level of that, I would say then that's when you want to start finding films that don't have any music, like the contest pieces, because you want to get the inflection of the dialogue. You want to understand the emotion and start learning how to read that so that you know whether to play heavier or back off. But I think those are great starting points. And then, like you said, on the networking side, that's exactly how I did it. I really met the Phoenix Independent Filmmakers through a 48-hour film challenge that I signed up for. I didn't have a team. I just went to a meeting and I met Tamara McDaniel, and she goes, "Oh, you're a composer. You're on my team." I'm like, "All right, great." And then I started doing every film challenge because we entered every film challenge.
I would say the only thing to those people is just to be a little bit careful, because when you and I started doing it or whatever, I think people were much more honest about that. And so now, unfortunately, I have actually seen where two different situations. One is where, they say, well, if you want to enter this challenge, then it's going to cost you $10.
Right. Yeah.
For you to score it. If you're scoring music for somebody, don't pay them $10 to score music for them. Okay. That's just wrong. And then the other is where they go, well, you're going to, there's this competition, you're going to get into it. And then when you get into it, the prize that you could win, let's say let's say something like the prize is a $20 gift card for, musician's friend or something or whatever. But then they say, but you agree that, this is complete property of, Jack and Jill Productions, and we can sell it or do whatever we want to with it and blah, blah. I mean, chances are you're not going to make, if you're early on, you're not going to make something that they can use anyway. But, some of these people, I mean, they're not very good people, and they take advantage of, people who make music that way. And so you just got to be careful about a little bit of that,
That's very true. And on a lot of the contests, at least the ones that I worked in Arizona, you cannot pay or compensate. That's part of the challenge, is that everybody's doing it for free. So also know your rules, know what it is that you're getting into.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Bruce, man, it has just been so great talking to you. This is interesting because you and I have spoken over the net a few times, but this is the first time we've ever spoken.
It is. And unfortunately, we've got about 5 more hours of stuff to talk about.
Well, and I'm very confident that we will be having another conversation on this show.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with me tonight. I think there are some absolutely great pieces of information that you gave. I think very inspirational and really thought-provoking too as a composer. I really like your approach, and it's not surprising that so many people are after you to work on their projects.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it too, man. I mean, I think it's just, it's anything that we could do to kind of help the exposure of all of us together as composers, because there's just so many things out there now that are taking away some of the opportunities for composers, and we're all trying to fight to climb upward. We have all of these things falling. It's kind of like climbing a ladder and somebody's constantly throwing bricks down at you. It's
right.
It's like there's all these new technologies and things. There's so many people that say, "Oh, I'll work for free," and just mention me and all of this stuff, and new pieces of software that websites that will automatically compose music for you and things like that, all this stuff. So it's a difficult challenge. Anything we can all do together to kind of lift each other up,
Well, we just took Discovery Channel down, so it kind of feel like we're on fire now.
Yeah, that was really important, and I'm glad that turned out the way that it did, because I was kind of worried about that for a while.
Yeah, I was really back and forth on a couple of points on it, but I think the thing that bothered me the most was, if I understood this right, they wanted to change already signed contracts to change the composer's compensation for things that were already done. Now, if you want to change the rates of somebody that's starting a new contract or a new project, that's up to you. And then it's up to the composer whether they're going to agree to it or not. That's fine. But to say, I know I was paying you X amount per viewing, but I really don't want to do that anymore, so you're just going to accept this lower amount. That's not right.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall the whole attitude, again, the attitude that they're having as an industry towards this is just, I mean, if compose, and not just composers, but other people in the industry as well, if you don't band together and kind of like let people know that you're not going to, this isn't right, we're not going to let you get away with it, then it's going to be difficult for composers going forward.
Well, yeah. And I'm glad that we squashed this so quickly and so early, so that maybe we set the precedence to where this won't be something we'll see a whole lot of.
Yeah. I would say so. I would say that it's, again, it's really hard in the industry as it is, and nobody's making the money that they were making unless you're HZ. I mean, you're not making the money that you were making. So it's like, it's really difficult when this is your vocation to have some of those things, kind of happening around you.
Yeah. Well, it was a good day for us for sure. And it's a great day that I got to hang out with you and got some insight into your process. And man, I just wish you the best of continued success.
Thanks, man. You as well. And I'm sure we'll stay in touch and keep trying to find new ways to do new things.
Absolutely. I love it. You have a great night, my friend.
All right. You too, buddy. And I'll talk at you later.
Sounds good. Yeah, what a great guy and what a great approach to film. I love his attitude. I love his willingness to not just say, I know everything, I'm still learning and I'm still experimenting. Because I think when we stop experimenting is when we kind of die a little bit as artists. And Bruce is definitely alive and kicking, and I love it. And I'm not surprised that he is in as high demand as he is. But if you're looking for a film score, he's one of those people I would say you should give a call to, because he'll give you something really, really great, and he'll work with you on it to make sure that it's what you want, and maybe even turn you on to some other possibilities that you might not have thought of. So there's Bruce, and thank you, Bruce, for coming on the show. Thank you guys for joining me on another episode of the HaskinCast Podcast. I'll be back with episode number 99 very shortly. Talk to you soon. Bye.